1944, and on the Eastern Front, Hitler's forces were being pushed back towards the German border. But Germany was about to face a new threat. In the West, Allied forces had been preparing for months to open a new front in northwest France. To test the waters, British forces had already mounted a number of practice operations. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life.
What if the largest amphibious invasion in human history had ended not on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, but in the water in front of it? What if the postcard image everyone has of June 6, 1944, the ramps dropping, the beaches secured by nightfall, the slow grind toward Paris beginning, never actually happened that way? What if instead the news that reached London on the 7th of June wasn't victory, but a full withdrawal, and the war in the West had to be planned again almost from scratch? Because here's what people forget about D-Day. We talk about it like the outcome was locked in the moment the ships left Portsmouth. It wasn't. Eisenhower himself, the night before the landings, wrote a private note taking full personal responsibility in case the invasion failed, planning to release it publicly if it did. He wrote that note because everyone at the top of Overlord genuinely believed failure was a live possibility, not a formality to cover himself. And when you actually look at how close a couple of the beaches came to failing outright, even in the real timeline, that fear looks completely reasonable. So quick recap. By the spring of 1944, Germany knows an invasion of France is coming. They just don't know where or exactly when. Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, has convinced much of the German high command that the real invasion will land at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point, and that Normandy, if it's hit at all, is a diversion. That belief is so deeply planted that it survives the actual landings by weeks, with Hitler personally keeping the powerful 15th Army parked near Calais long after Normandy is obviously the main event, waiting for a second blow that never comes. Inside the German command in France, there's also a real argument happening about how to fight the invasion once it lands, and this argument matters more than almost anything else in this story. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commands the coastal defenses, believes the invasion has to be crushed on the beaches themselves in the first hours before the Allies can land enough men and armor to matter. His argument is simple. Allied air power owns the skies over France so completely that once German reserves start moving inland to counterattack, they'll be spotted and shredded before they arrive. So Rommel wants the panzer divisions dug in right behind the beaches, ready to hit the invasion in its first hours while it's still weak. Rommel's superior, Rundstedt, along with the armor specialist, Geyer von Schweppenburg, disagree. They want the panzers held back in a central reserve, well inland, ready to identify the real main thrust and deliver one massive, concentrated counterattack once the picture is clear. Hitler splits the difference, the worst possible outcome. Most of the panzer divisions get held in an OKW reserve that can't move without Hitler's personal authorization. Nobody gets what they actually need. Then there's the 5th of June itself. The weather is genuinely awful, high winds, rough seas, low cloud, bad enough that German meteorologists tell their commanders no invasion is possible for at least another 2 weeks. Rommel, trusting that forecast, leaves for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to personally lobby Hitler for more panzer divisions. A number of other senior officers head to Rennes for a map exercise. Eisenhower's own meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, spots a narrow, unexpected break in the weather and gives Eisenhower the window he needs. The Allies go on June 6th into a Normandy that is, for a few critical hours, missing several of the men who would otherwise be commanding its response. And even with all of that going for the Allies, June 6th is closer than the postcard version admits. Utah Beach goes relatively well. Sword, Juno, and Gold, the British and Canadian beaches, go reasonably to plan, though Sword takes a real scare when 21st Panzer Division, the one armoured unit already positioned close to the coast, launches a counterattack that actually reaches the sea between Sword and Juno before running out of steam and pulling back at dusk. But Omaha is the one that almost breaks. American troops there land in front of a German division nobody expected to be in that sector into pillboxes and interlocking machine gun fire that survived the naval and air bombardment almost completely intact on a beach with almost no cover. For hours on the morning of the 6th, senior American commanders are seriously considering evacuating Omaha entirely and diverting the follow-up waves elsewhere. It holds, but barely, and mostly because of small groups of junior officers and enlisted men improvising their way off the sand under fire, not because the plan worked as designed. So here's our divergence, and I want to be precise about it, because there are really two hinges sitting right next to each other, and either one on its own is enough. What if Rommel doesn't go to Germany for his wife's birthday? What if he stays at his headquarters, gets word of unusual Allied naval activity picked up by coastal radar stations that, in our timeline, got dismissed or reported too late up the chain, and personally orders 21st Panzer forward at first light instead of mid-morning, while simultaneously bypassing the OKW reserve requirement by using his own authority and reputation to pressure a reluctant Rundstedt into releasing Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division hours earlier than they historically moved. And second, what if the aides in Hitler's headquarters this time don't spend the early hours of June 6th afraid to wake him, because Rommel himself is on the phone insisting this is the real invasion, not a feint toward Calais. Run that forward and the whole shape of the day changes. Instead of arriving in the afternoon and evening of June 6th, worn down by air attacks along the way, Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS reach the invasion front in the pre-dawn hours of the 7th, while the Allied beachheads are still shallow, still short on armour and heavy artillery that hasn't finished coming ashore, and still stitching themselves together into a continuous front. Omaha, already the closest beach to failure in the real timeline, doesn't hold, with 21st Panzer hitting from the east at first light instead of mid-morning, and with American forces at Omaha still fighting for the bluffs rather than past them. The beachhead there collapses under a combined infantry and armour counterattack before noon on the 6th. The follow-up waves scheduled to land through the day get diverted or held offshore, and by nightfall, Omaha is being written off as a lost beach, with survivors being pulled back onto landing craft under fire in scenes that would look to history less like victory and more like a second Dunkirk. Sword and Juno don't collapse outright. The British and Canadian sectors were always the strongest, but the gap opened up by Omaha's failure and 21st Panzer's morning breakthrough drives a wedge between the American and British sectors that never gets closed in the way it historically did within the first week. Utah, cut off from reinforcement and resupply because the plan always depended on Omaha linking up with it, ends up isolated, a viable but strategically dangling foothold that Eisenhower has to decide whether to reinforce at enormous cost or evacuate. There's a grim, practical detail worth sitting with here too, because it's the kind of thing that decides battles far more than grand strategy does. The Mulberry Harbours, the artificial ports the Allies towed across the channel in pieces to unload heavy equipment without needing to capture an intact French port, were built specifically because planners assumed the Germans would demolish every real harbour before it could be taken. Those harbours depend entirely on a secure beachhead to assemble behind, with Omaha collapsing and the American and British sectors no longer forming one continuous front. The Mulberry assigned to the American sector never gets fully assembled at all, and the equivalent bottleneck that historically slowed the Allied build-up even after a successful landing becomes here an outright choke point. Tanks, artillery, and fuel that are supposed to be flowing ashore within days are instead stacking up on ships circling offshore with nowhere safe to unload, while the men already ashore run short on exactly the heavy weapons they'd need to hold what little ground they still have. And this is where the war planners back in London face the decision that actually reshapes everything. Do you pour everything you have into holding and expanding the surviving beachheads, accepting that Overlord has become a much smaller, much bloodier operation than planned, or do you pull back entirely and accept that the invasion of France has failed for 1944, with the tidal and lunar conditions needed for a landing of this scale not lining up again for weeks, by which point the element of surprise, already thin, is completely gone and the Germans know exactly where you're coming? Historically, this is a genuinely agonizing decision because everyone involved understands what a full withdrawal means. It means Overlord doesn't happen again in 1944. It means the Western Allies spend the rest of the year restricted to the slow, brutal grind up the Italian peninsula and the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, while the entire weight of defeating the Wehrmacht on the ground continues to fall overwhelmingly on the Soviet Union, which is already absorbing the vast majority of German combat power on the Eastern Front. Stalin, who has been pressing his allies for a second front since 1942, does not take a failed, withdrawn invasion well, and the wartime alliance, already strained by mutual suspicion, comes under a kind of pressure it never actually had to survive in our history. For Germany, a defeated invasion doesn't win the war. Not by 1944, the disparity in industrial output between Germany and the combined Allied economies is far too large for one battlefield victory to erase, but it buys something almost as valuable: time, and time changes what tools are available to both sides. By the time the war does end, a Western Front that doesn't open until the spring of 1945 instead of the summer of 1944 is a Western Front that opens after the Manhattan Project has already produced a working weapon. In our timeline, the atomic bomb was ready in the summer of 1945, aimed at Japan because Germany had already surrendered in May. Push the collapse of Germany's Western Front back by 6 to 9 months, and you get a Germany that is still fighting, still occupying most of France, still absorbing the entire strategic bombing campaign in the exact window when that weapon becomes available, with planners in Washington and London having to seriously weigh using it against Berlin instead of Tokyo, a decision nobody in our actual history ever had to make, and one there's no comfortable way to speculate all the way through. Inside occupied France, the immediate human cost of a failed Omaha lands hardest on the people who had the least say in any of it. The French resistance, acting on Allied instructions, sabotaged rail lines and communications across Normandy in the days before the landings, specifically to slow German reinforcements to the beaches on the promise that liberation was finally actually arriving. When the beachhead there collapses and the front stabilizes well short of where it was supposed to reach in the first week, those networks are left exposed, their sabotage plainly tied to an invasion that visibly failed to hold its ground, and German reprisals across Normandy and Brittany in the weeks that follow are worse than anything the region experienced historically, precisely because the occupying command wants to make an example before any second attempt. Goebbels' propaganda ministry, for its part, gets the single best gift of the entire war: a failed Allied invasion. Thousands of prisoners marched through Cherbourg and Paris for the newsreel cameras, framed as final proof that the war in the West is unwinnable for the Allies, and that Germany's Atlantic Wall has done exactly what it was built to do. It's not true in any strategic sense. The war is still being lost on the Eastern Front and in the air over German cities every single day. But propaganda doesn't need to be true. It needs to be usable, and for the first time in 2 years, Berlin has genuinely good news to broadcast. Back in London, Churchill faces a version of a problem he thought he'd left behind in 1940. He staked enormous personal and political capital on Overlord succeeding, having pushed hard against American planners who wanted to invade France as early as 1943, arguing that the timing and preparation had to be exactly right. A failed invasion on ground, and at a moment he helped choose, reopens every argument from the Mediterranean strategy debates of the previous 2 years, with critics in his own war cabinet asking not unreasonably, whether the whole approach to the Western War has been wrong from the start. He survives it. Churchill always seemed to survive these moments, but he survives it wounded, spending political capital on holding his coalition together at exactly the moment the Americans, footing the overwhelming majority of the invasion's cost in men and material, start pushing harder for control over how and when a second attempt gets planned. The political fallout lands hard and fast too. Eisenhower's private note, the one taking responsibility in case of failure, actually gets released, and a Supreme Allied commander who oversees the worst amphibious disaster since Gallipoli does not simply get a second attempt handed to him by history the way the real Eisenhower's success guaranteed him. Roosevelt, facing re-election in November of 1944, has to run on a war that is visibly not going as promised, at the exact moment his opponents are looking for any evidence that the administration's strategy has failed. None of this loses America the war. The industrial gap is still there, the Pacific Campaign is still grinding forward regardless, and the Soviet steamroller in the East doesn't stop rolling west just because Overlord stumbled, but it stretches the war in Europe by the better part of a year, and every month that gets added to a war this destructive is a month paid for in cities, in supply lines, and in an entire additional winter for a Europe that was already starving. There's also the question of what a failed Overlord does to the atmosphere inside Germany itself, and it cuts in an unexpectedly dangerous direction. Historically, the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler happened partly because a growing circle of officers, including men serving on the Western Front, had concluded the war was unwinnable, and that only removing Hitler could open the door to a negotiated peace before total ruin. A Germany that has just handed the Allies their worst defeat since Dunkirk is a Germany where that argument loses almost all of its force. Hitler's prestige among the officer corps, badly damaged by 1944, in our actual history gets a genuine, if temporary, boost, and the conspirators around Claus von Stauffenberg lose both the practical opportunity and the internal argument for going through with the plot at all. The war doesn't get shorter because the resistance inside Germany loses its nerve. It gets longer, run by a regime with renewed confidence in exactly the kind of gambler's instinct that got it into this war in the first place. For the Soviet Union, watching all of this from the East, the calculus shifts too. Stalin has been extracting promise after promise about a second front since 1942, and a failed Overlord, whatever the official communiques say about it, confirms every suspicion he's ever had, that his Western allies are content to let the Red Army bleed while they take their time. The Soviet advance through 1944 and into 1945, already staggering in scale, becomes the only real ground war against Germany left standing. And Stalin's negotiating position at whatever conference eventually settles the shape of post-war Europe gets stronger with every month the Western Allies spend regrouping rather than advancing. The map of a divided Germany and a divided Europe that actually got drawn at Yalta and Potsdam was already generous to Soviet demands given how much of the fighting the Red Army had done. At a year of the Western Allies visibly failing to open a real second front, and there's very little room left for anyone in London or Washington to argue for a gentler line over how far east that dividing line should sit. What I keep coming back to with this one is how much of what actually saved D-Day historically came down to two men simply not being where they needed to be. Rommel at home for a birthday, Hitler asleep, and nobody willing to knock. Move either one of those small, human, almost accidental facts, and the invasion that ended the war in Europe within a year instead becomes the disaster that very nearly ended it in stalemate. Sometimes the hinge of history isn't a battle plan at all. It's just a phone that doesn't get answered in time.